The world does not reward the kindest people, even if the horizon still carries the illusion of fairness we were taught to believe in for years. Instead, the world obeys a hidden architecture of power, where structural position and spatial control matter far more than sincerity or pure intentions. A good person believes in the quiet light within himself and assumes that light is enough to influence the system around him. But an open structure lacking any internal defense becomes utterly vulnerable to the cold wind of reality, where cold calculation always outweighs emotional warmth. Society operates as an invisible grid of silent positions, invisibly stretched beneath the feet of everyone who steps into the harsh domain of human interaction. One person enters this space armed only with a moral code, while another enters fully equipped with a deep understanding of leverage and pressure points. The ultimate difference between them lies not in the volume of their words, but in the profound depth of their spatial and structural awareness. One fragile soul endlessly seeks the pure harmony of light, while the calculating strategist quietly seeks absolute control over the surrounding shadow. Final victory rarely belongs to those who remain morally pure, but almost always to the one who truly understands scale, timing, and structural architecture. This outcome is not driven by personal cruelty or malice. It is simply the raw structure of reality, indifferent, silent, cold, and entirely unmoving. From early childhood, we are systematically taught to be deeply agreeable, to create zero tension in the room, and to deliberately occupy less space. We are consistently praised for our quiet obedience and compliance, but almost never taught how to successfully defend our own personal boundaries. We learn to nod and agree far too quickly, long before we ever learn to question our fundamental right to exist fully. And as the years pass by, this habitual compliance ceases to be merely a temporary behavior, hardening instead into a permanent identity. But the unforgiving pressure of adult reality eventually tests every single structure within us that completely lacks internal reinforcement or a solid foundation. Within the harsh logic of this environment, pure intention means almost nothing, while exact structural position means absolutely everything to survival and influence. Silent social hierarchies form entirely on their own, completely without official announcements, yet carrying massive and long-lasting consequences for everyone involved in the system. The brightest illumination always falls upon the one who manages to stand higher and projects absolute certainty, regardless of internal doubt. Meanwhile, the person who hesitates and doubts themselves slowly drifts backward into the gathering shadow, losing all psychological weight. And in that critical moment of silent tension, the inherently good person is almost always the one who steps backward first. Gradually, he begins to notice that the space around him feels colder and wider, while his actual influence within that structure quietly continues to shrink. The weight of responsibility increases steadily upon his shoulders, yet his formal position inside the hierarchy remains strangely unchanged and structurally limited. He gives more time, more energy, and more emotional stability, but receives no additional authority to shape the outcomes he helps create. Exhaustion begins to accumulate beneath his calm exterior, though he refuses to show visible resistance, fearing disruption more than depletion. To him, resistance feels like aggression, like introducing unnecessary fracture into a fragile environment, already balanced on unspoken tension. He chooses approval as a substitute for stability, believing external validation will compensate for the absence of structural security. But approval proves to be an unstable currency, valuable only temporarily, and incapable of forming any lasting foundation. True respect does not emerge from endless accommodation, but from clearly defined boundaries, calmly enforced without emotional escalation. As he compresses himself to avoid conflict, others expand naturally into the unclaimed territory he quietly abandons. Nothing dramatic occurs. No confrontation explodes. Yet subtle fractures begin spreading through the structure of his position. Each additional compromise thins the internal pillars that once supported his sense of grounded presence within the wider architecture. Eventually, he realizes he is no longer standing on solid psychological ground, but on something gradually eroding beneath pressure. For years, he believed his inner light would naturally shield him from exploitation, as though goodness alone carried defensive strength. But light without defined structure becomes exposed, easily targeted by those who understand strategic positioning. Most people may not articulate it clearly, yet they instinctively sense imbalances of power within any shared environment. Pressure rarely moves toward resistance. It naturally flows toward the point where boundaries appear weakest. He continues offering patience and softness, even as his internal reserves diminish quietly beneath accumulated expectation. The system does not label him virtuous. It simply registers available capacity and adjusts accordingly. No one consciously declares exploitation. Instead, incremental demands expand until his contribution becomes assumed rather than appreciated. Where pride once lived, a subtle emptiness now settles, quiet, persistent, and difficult to ignore. Over time, the fear of conflict grows larger than the conflict itself, becoming an internal barrier that limits him before any real confrontation begins. He starts softening his tone in advance, rounding sharp edges from his language, long before anyone demands it. In smoothing those edges, he gradually erases the clear outline of his own position. Strategy begins where naive expectation ends, where he stops assuming that fairness will organize itself. It is not aggression. It is the ability to observe structure, timing, and leverage without emotional distortion. The strategic mind maps elevation and influence before speaking, before reacting, before committing energy. Instead of raising his voice, it simply adjusts position, subtly shifting within the architecture of the moment. It does not attack the wall directly. It studies the seams, the tension points, the structural weaknesses. Its primary tool is clarity, a focused awareness that cuts through confusion, without emotional turbulence. Yet he mistakes clarity for cruelty, believing firmness automatically threatens the fragile harmony he tries to preserve. He fears that a steady boundary will wound others and permanently damage relational equilibrium. So he retreats again, not because the moment truly requires surrender, but because years of conditioning have taught him that standing still might somehow be mistaken for cruelty. Repeated retreat becomes a visible pattern, and once people feel that pattern, they begin pressing harder because predictability always invites more pressure than resistance does. His character starts bending in response to expectation, until adaptation quietly replaces authentic positioning, and he can no longer tell where habit ends and self begins. But strategy is not emotional coldness, and it is not a rejection of empathy. It is long-term vision applied carefully to present decisions. It is the quiet ability to close a door gently, without slamming it, without apologizing for it, and without leaving it open for endless intrusion. It is the strength to remain silent when others try to fill every pause with urgency, pressure, or the illusion that immediate answers are always required. It is composure that does not depend on applause, reassurance, or constant external validation, because real stability does not need to be announced in order to exist. That kind of composure feels unfamiliar to him at first, almost uncomfortable, because it no longer receives constant feedback from the people who once shaped his self-worth. But awareness has already begun shifting his center of gravity, and even before his actions change, his inner posture is no longer completely submissive. He begins to notice an unfamiliar silence inside himself, a space where constant agreement once lived, and that silence feels both unsettling and strangely honest. For the first time, he allows himself to admit that he is exhausted from being structurally reliable, while remaining strategically invisible. A quiet internal protest starts forming, not loud enough to disturb the outside world, but strong enough to disturb his previous identity. This protest does not arrive as anger or rebellion. It arrives as weight, as density returning to a center that once felt hollow. He begins noticing moments where he automatically agrees, and for the first time, he pauses before surrendering his position. That pause feels unnatural, almost dangerous, as though the structure around him might collapse if he does not immediately comply. Yet nothing collapses. The world does not shatter. The system simply recalibrates around his stillness. And in that recalibration, he senses something subtle shifting, a redistribution of weight he never realized was possible. He understands now that choice was always present, but responsibility for that choice was something he had long avoided. Accepting that responsibility feels heavy at first, because it removes the comfort of blaming the structure alone. He experiments with holding his ground in small moments, testing the strength of a boundary that previously existed only in theory. The first quiet no does not sound aggressive, but it carries a firmness that even he can feel in his chest. He braces himself for backlash or rejection, imagining emotional fallout that never fully materializes. Instead, there is a pause, a recalculation in the room, as others reassess his structural position. Some individuals instinctively step back, recognizing that the previously open space is no longer freely accessible. Others push lightly against the new boundary, as if testing whether it is temporary or truly reinforced. And in those testing moments, his consistency becomes more important than any explanation he could provide. Fear remains present within him, but it no longer dictates movement. It merely accompanies growth. A new sensation begins forming, not pride, not triumph, but steady, grounded self-respect. And he finally understands that kindness without structure does not survive the weight of reality. It slowly dissolves beneath it. The danger now is not weakness, but overcorrection, the temptation to become so defended and so closed that strategy transforms quietly into emotional isolation. After years of absorbing pressure without resistance, the sudden appeal of complete hardness feels almost logical, as though only an extreme could compensate for past vulnerability. He feels the pull toward permanent distance, toward keeping everyone at arm's length, as a preventative measure against future exploitation. But total closure does not produce strength. It produces a different kind of suffering, the suffering of voluntary and self-imposed isolation. Mature strategy does not require the elimination of warmth. It requires the elimination of unconditional access to that warmth by anyone who demands it. Strength does not mean becoming colder than the system. It means learning to distribute your warmth, deliberately, consciously, and with clear awareness of return. He begins to understand that boundaries are not walls, built to exclude the world, but rather the defined outline of his internal territory. And territory does not require aggression to be maintained. It requires consistent, calm, and attentive presence that communicates ownership without hostility. He learns to distinguish between moments that deserve voluntary compromise and moments that require him to remain unmoved, regardless of external discomfort. This distinction is no longer a reaction to pressure. It becomes a deliberate and informed choice, grounded in awareness of long-term consequences. He begins noticing that respect appears in spaces where it previously never existed, arriving quietly where clear positioning has replaced endless accommodation. Some relationships grow quieter but considerably deeper because the hidden imbalance of energy has finally been removed from their foundation. Others fade without confrontation or dramatic ending, unable to sustain themselves once unconditional access is no longer available as a structural resource. And he discovers that certain losses do not feel like damage. They feel like space being cleared for something more structurally honest. He no longer orients his decisions around universal approval because he now understands the real price of maintaining that exhausting and unsustainable standard. Instead, he chooses consistency with himself, even when that consistency creates temporary friction in environments built around his previous compliance. His warmth remains intact and fully present, but it is no longer dispersed without awareness into spaces that return nothing of equal value. Self-respect is no longer a fleeting emotional response. It has become a stable internal structure that holds its shape independent of external conditions. With that structure in place, a different kind of calm arrives, not the calm of suppression or numbness, but the calm of genuine internal alignment. He holds both truths simultaneously now. Strategy without humanity destroys the self, and humanity without strategy slowly surrenders it. He no longer sees these as opposing forces, pulling in irreconcilable directions, but as two elements requiring careful and conscious integration. Empathy without positioning leaves a person perpetually exposed to systems that have no interest in reciprocating the energy they consume. And positioning without empathy produces a version of success that feels structurally stable, but internally hollow and ultimately meaningless. The integration he is building is neither comfortable nor immediate. It is a slow recalibration of every assumption he once held about safety and belonging. He begins operating from a different internal frequency, less reactive, less approval-seeking, more grounded in what he actually values. Decisions feel different now, less driven by the fear of disapproval, and more shaped by a clearer sense of his own direction and purpose. He speaks less frequently in certain rooms, but when he does speak, the weight of his words has visibly changed. He no longer fills silence with nervous justification or reflexive agreement, allowing the space to carry its own meaning. Others begin responding to him differently, not because he has become harder or more aggressive, but because his presence now has structural definition. And that definition, quiet and unannounced as it is, communicates something that years of kindness alone were never able to fully deliver. He understands now that goodness was never the problem. The absence of structure around that goodness was what made it fragile inside competitive environments. For years, he confused being liked with being respected, not realizing that these two outcomes are produced by entirely different structural dynamics. Being liked requires accommodation and emotional availability. Being respected requires boundaries, consistency, and visible ownership of one's position. The world does not punish kindness directly. It simply tests whether that kindness is supported by something solid beneath it. Without reinforcement, even the purest intention slowly bends under repeated external pressure until its original shape becomes unrecognizable. Strength, he realizes, is not loud, dramatic, or theatrical. It is quiet structural integrity that remains intact under sustained weight. Integrity is not merely moral alignment. It is the alignment between inner belief and outer positioning within the system. When those two dimensions finally synchronize, something inside him stabilizes in a way that no external praise ever achieved. He stops trying to be universally understood because he no longer needs universal approval to justify his existence. Clarity replaces anxiety, not because the world has softened, but because his internal structure has strengthened. He now enters rooms with awareness rather than assumption, observing the architecture of influence before investing emotional energy. He no longer mistakes silence for rejection, nor disagreement for hostility, nor pressure for personal attack. Instead, he evaluates interactions through structure, asking where leverage exists and where genuine reciprocity can grow. Some environments reveal themselves as extractive, designed to consume rather than collaborate, and he adjusts accordingly. Other environments prove capable of mutual reinforcement, where boundaries do not threaten connection, but actually deepen it. In those spaces, his kindness becomes stronger, because it is no longer driven by fear or the need to secure belonging. He gives freely where reciprocity exists, and withholds where imbalance persists, without guilt or internal collapse. This selective openness feels different from defensiveness. It feels intentional, measured, and anchored in self-respect. He understands now that boundaries are not barriers against love. They are the framework that makes sustainable connection possible. And he no longer equates discomfort with wrongdoing, because growth often introduces friction before it introduces relief. The fear of being perceived as selfish loses its control over him as he redefines selfishness through structural clarity. Selfishness, he realizes, is not self-protection. It is disregard for others, without regard for consequence. Self-respect, by contrast, honors both sides of the equation, protecting internal stability while remaining conscious of external impact. This balance does not make him harsher. It makes him more deliberate, more precise, and ultimately more dependable. Ironically, the moment he stops trying to be convenient is the moment he becomes structurally valuable. Because value in complex systems is rarely assigned to those who yield, but to those who hold their shape. He no longer sees the world as hostile, but as structured, and structure can be navigated. The game did not disappear. He simply learned to recognize it, without surrendering his humanity. Kindness remains within him, but now it stands on reinforced ground, supported by awareness and deliberate positioning. And in that integration of clarity and compassion, he finally stops losing, not because he changed the world, but because he changed his stance within it.